Hello everybody, my name is Jürgen Gmach. It's fantastic to be back in Prague and here for the very first time for EuroPython. And today I want to help you to create your very first contribution to open source. Contributing to open source seems intimidating for a lot of people. Like, you might have questions like, is this something for me? Or is this something only for some professionals? Do I have enough experience? You may not know where to look for a suitable open source project. Or maybe there are too many out there and you don't know which one you want to contribute to. You also might wonder, why should you contribute to open source at all? If you have any of these questions, then you're in the right spot here. I think contributing to open source is for everyone. And my mission today is that after this talk, all your doubts will be gone. I will show you that anyone can contribute to open source, regardless of experience, professional status, gender, home language, and especially age. It's never too late to join the party, from my own experience. So before we go into that, what is open source at all? So open source is source code that is made freely available for possible modification and redistribution. That's on Wikipedia. So basically, early instances of free sharing, this was already dated back to the 50s and to the 60s when IBM's source code was made freely available. But the term open source was only coined like 25, a little bit more than 25 years ago at an O'Reilly Media conference. And at this conference, people were thinking about what kind of different term could be used to free software. And there were a couple of other suggestions, which luckily never made it. But at some point, there were people like Linus Torvalds, which you probably know, Larry Wall, and obviously Guido von Rossum, the inventor of Python. And at one point, they had a couple of different suggestions, and then at the end, they all agreed on open source. So I think this is mind-blowing if you think like this idea or the spirit, and especially this movement was basically only created a little bit longer than 25 years ago. And I think open source is changing the world. So what are the benefits of contributing to open source? And you need to know everything I say now is especially true for a beginner. So this is not only for some professionals. And you still might wonder, why should you contribute to open source? And I see two big groups of reasons and compelling reasons to do so. The first one is about the project itself. So the project can be used by anyone in the world. I know my neighbor uses Linux to do his taxes, print a couple of letters, and surf the internet. My dentist uses Linux to safely manage the data for his patient. My dad uses LibreOffice to write some letters, and I use open source to manage the photos for my family. And I have one dear colleague who uses open source to create fantastic music. Open source is used both by individuals and by companies alike, maybe because of budget, because of security reasons, or maybe just because it's the better solution. And these are just a few of many, many examples. I'm especially fascinated by the scaling effect of open source. So I probably maintain things which only I use. They're still open source, so anybody can at least look at it. 1, 2 people can use it, 5 people, or millions. And either for their personal benefit, or maybe to make a living out of that, from that. On the other hand, there are also great benefits for yourself. You could improve the tool that you're using anyway. That's how things start quite often, that you use a tool and you think, oh, maybe this bug is annoying and the maintainer doesn't have time, or this little feature is missing. Especially looking at Anthony, I think if you basically need a way how to not become a maintainer of too many open source projects, probably you should talk with Anthony about that one. And one thing which is especially true and which is always still fascinating, like you can work with the brightest minds on the world. Like obviously, maybe in your company or in your environment, you already work with great people, but in open source, there are no borders. So you can also work, you also will get feedback on your merge proposals from world-class engineers not working for your company. You will see how other professionals work. And take me as an example. At the beginning of my career, I worked at a local company with 50 people in rural Bavaria. 49 of them were Smalltalk developers, and I was the only Python developer. Like, obviously, they knew a couple of things, and they shared the knowledge over the generations, but they couldn't help me a lot with Python. When I started contributing to open source, I collaborated with the brightest minds on Earth, I think, from Bloomberg, Facebook, Google, Canonical, many other companies, and the feedback I got was invaluable. You also will get exposure and get noticed. You will build a professional network when you work with others, just like here when you attend a conference. And this might be very helpful to land your next job. And you will stand out. You will be 1 in 1,000 or maybe 1 in 1,000,000 who actively contributed to open source. This could help your career. You could even land a new job. As part of my job at Canonical, I need to review a lot of interviews and applications and have a lot of interviews. And I basically always hear like, oh yeah, open source is great, but I haven't contributed yet. And this is like when they're applying at an open source company. And we especially look for open source experience when we have a look at the CV or at the whole package of the applicant. So open source can help you to stand out from the masters. If you can put, I've contributed to open source on your CV, this will be a game changer. So a little bit about myself. My name is Jürgen Gmach. I'm an interim engineering manager and a senior software engineer at Canonical. You can reach out to me on X or Mastodon. I also have a blog. I'm one of the 2 maintainers of Tox, which is currently, I think, down at like 20 million times a month. And this is used across open source projects and big tech companies alike. I have contributed to more than 300 open source projects meanwhile, and I was questions about that at lunch break. If you want to challenge me, we can have a talk, small talk later on, how I manage this. And I work full-time on open source at Canonical, where I maintain the build and the publishing infrastructure of Ubuntu, which is, I don't know whether Red Hat people are around, probably one of the world's most popular Linux distributions. The thing you need to know, I only started to contribute to open source a couple of years ago, after being a professional web and backend developer for more than a decade. So while I used open source projects before, I never saw the chance or the need to contribute. And at one of my first jobs, I inherited a very old internet application based on Python 2 and SOAP 2. And there was the task for me as the single developer to migrate it to Python 3. So while the Python 2 to Python 3 migration is well understood and there were some guidelines, migrating the application would be okay, but migrating the complete ecosystem is out of scope for a single developer. But luckily, this framework was still used across a couple of other companies and organizations, and then as it's open source, we all come together to sprints, and we basically had regular sprints over the course of a couple of years where we moved this forward and finally ported it to Python 3. And this was a huge thing. Like 50 people or something like that working together from the most diverse companies and organizations, and I think this is an open source success story. This is where my journey in open source started, and I hope it will never end. But your journey might be very, very different. So what is an open source contribution? I think Savannah already scratched this topic this morning. The most obvious thing most people will probably think about is contributing to code, fixing a bug, adding a feature. This is certainly true, but these kind of contributions are not the only one. And they're certainly also probably the most complex ones. And there are other choices, a lot of them. So you could create a bug report or a feature request. And when you do that, you should be very careful about it, describing it, the problem in detail, and maybe giving a good reproducer so it's easy for the maintainer to evaluate what's going on. You could help triaging bugs. We had this like probably 30 times this morning. Triaging bugs is really a big thing. And I think this is one of the first things I did for the TOX project. Like I had a look and there are so many old issues and like, oh, it looks like this is already fixed and is still valid in version 3.14 or something like that. You can also have a look whether those tickets are complete. Maybe people just raise, oh, I have an error, and maybe put one log line, and then it's not enough to reproduce the thing. I encounter these things still daily, also at my work. Or maybe the ticket is also a duplicate, or is already well known. Also, improvements for design and usability are highly available, but they happen very rarely, and I hope there will be some change in future. And last but not least, it's about contributing to the project's documentation. This is also super valuable. When I use a library for the first time, I have a look at the documentation, try out the examples, and more often than not, I find either there's a little bit of a glitch in the documentation, maybe it's outdated, maybe it worked with a different older version, or maybe it's just not super user-friendly for me to understand. And then I create a pull request, and I try to improve the current situation and add something to the docs. And this is also like a good test for me, as when I want to use this library, is the maintainer still active? Because sometimes maintainers lose interest, especially when they change jobs, or maybe they change their entire tech stack, and then they're leaving projects behind, which is also good, or okay. Because with open source, anybody else can step in. So how do you find an open source project for contribution? And this is very individual. I never look for projects to contribute to. They come to me. So when I need to use a new library or framework for work, as mentioned before, I check the documentation. Maybe it's not compatible with the Python version I want to use, then I can work on that. Maybe it lacks a feature, or it has a bug. And this is my way, and yours might be very different. A now colleague chose a couple of high-profile Python open source projects and contributed to them. Had a look at them, at those starter issues, and made meaningful contributions. And this certainly stood out when I interviewed him for my team. And I'm super happy that Tushar is now in my team for 1 year. And by the way, Tushar is from India, because borders don't matter. On GitHub, you could also search for good first issue. This is a tag used for tickets when there's not a lot of context needed. But as Savannah mentioned this morning, not all projects actually apply this tag. I also want to highlight the Open Documentation Academy. This is an initiative created by my dear colleague Graham Morrison. So this is about collaboration between Canonical's documentation team and documentation newcomers, experts, and those in between, to help improve documentation and become better writers for the benefit of them and for the open source projects. And while this is an initiative by my company, this is open for all projects. And it works like that. Basically, as you, as the open source maintainer of a project, you can create well-defined tickets and problems, scopes of documentation, improvements, and then people from all over the world can pick them up and work on them, but they are not left alone. They have a dedicated technical offer from our side to support them to move this over the finish line. And we also have open hours where you can actually go on a Google Meet with them and chat about that. And actually, it works great. My own projects had a number of contributions and from people all over the world for different motivations. So unfortunately, my colleague is not here this time and can't give a workshop on that, but I want to invite anybody here. If you want to have your first open source contribution today, join me after the talk, and we will sit together and only stand up when this is done. Okay, how to start contributing to a project. So now you have found a project, and it's time to actually contribute. As I'm a maintainer of an open source project myself, I can tell you about the expectations from a maintainer's perspective. So do not create a pull request right ahead. Make sure to create a proper ticket where you describe your issue and have some discussion with the maintainer, because maybe the maintainer doesn't want to have this feature. Maybe it's just a lot of overhead for them. And once you have created the ticket, come to an agreement, and you created the pull request, please be patient. Many open source maintainers only work in their spare time. And they need to decide whether they want to spend time with their family or their hobbies, or work together with you to land your project, to your pull request. And eventually, they will have a look and provide great feedback for free. So, the key takeaways from this talk is, think about the benefits of contributing to open source and what applies to you. Then find a project you're interested in and get in touch with the maintainers and get sucked into this wonderful world. And one last thing, contributing to open source shouldn't be only at the expense of your spare time. I invite you to talk with your manager or your boss, and you might be surprised. I really was at my first job. Like, we were this proprietary shop, only Smalltalk developers, no open source knowledge or experience there. And I spoke with my boss, and he said, yes, spend half a day a week, and this gave me an entry point to open source. And once again, if you're interested in contributing to open source right now, please join me after the talk, or you can also scan this code and get in touch later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jürgen. It was very insightful and hopefully also motivating for you. Do we have any questions here? Okay, so please, if you have questions, there's a mic in the middle, and you can ask directly into the mic.
Hello. Okay, it does work. Oh, cool. You mentioned sort of your first open source contribution, and I was wondering if you still remember what that actually was and how you came to sit down. Okay, cool, we're doing this. So and what happened through your head?
There is some. I can't recall the name of the service.
Right.
Well, everything is centered around GitHub nowadays, and you can look up your very first contribution there. And actually, it was not that fancy. It was fixing an example of a Python book, which was they had the repository out there on GitHub. This is the first I can look up, probably before I maybe created an issue, which I still count as an open source contribution. And other than that, the most meaningful, or the first meaningful, was probably to this, meanwhile, very outdated Python framework.
Right. Cool.
Thanks.
No, thank you.
What was yours?
I haven't done it yet.
Okay, so this guy, we will watch him. He will not leave this room before he does that. Okay, so if there are no other questions, I would maybe ask, do you remember a really funny contribution to an open source, like funny stories from contributing?
I'm not well prepared for that. Like I have one. Maybe Anthony could. I don't know. Like back then, it was not that funny. Like I'm one of the maintainers of Tox, and Tox and PyTest both were created by Holger Krekel a long while ago, and we share some ideas, even some code at some point. We had this common library, this Py library, and I think it was Anthony who got rid of it because there was some path of like subversion vulnerability which we didn't use at all, but all the tools on GitHub created alerts that, oh, your application or your library is vulnerable, and then Anthony did some Python magic and created a shim or something like that, which worked very well for PyTest, but it broke Tox in a way that basically we still installed the package from PyPI, but I think the shim was shadowing that, and then we didn't only use the one thing from Py, but something else, and it couldn't find it. And this was like in a situation where I was currently building my house for my family, and I started working at Canonical and didn't have a lot of spare time. I think the other maintainer was sick at that time, and it was, well, at that time it was not funny, but now I can laugh with Anthony about it. And the very cool thing about that was that somebody from the community stepped up and actually helped us to resolve this issue, like as both maintainers were unavailable, and this is the beauty of open source.
So thank you. So if there are no more questions, then we will skip directly to the implementation phase. Thank you.
Thank you.